going on, guys? So I'm sitting here at my my Haltech wideband controller, their new CAN wideband controller. This kit that I bought. This is their newer style, and the idea behind this is to make it where it's really easy to wire in. I mean, like when you actually look at their wideband controller, and this is a single channel one. They have a dual channel one also. When you look at the wideband controller, you have this little CAN port here, which you basically just plug that in there, and then I have this is for my S2000. Haven't put it in yet, but you basically just plug this in, plug that in, and then all you have to do is this other harness here. You plug in one of the plugs, and then you have wires that go to your gauges. And you also have wires that there's the power wires, and it comes with its own little fuse. This is a little weather resistant, not waterproof, but it's like a little weather resistant fuse box. So you wire that into positive and connect it to a switched ignition source. So I'm not using this actually. I'm kind of setting it aside because I'm going to have this running on the inside of the car. At least, well, if I can get this harness to reach, it's actually going to be plugged in underneath the hood. But I'm going to be using this little Viper. I have part of a little Viper wire harness that's just kind of not being used, so I decided to cut this little fuse holder off of it. It's the same gauge that I need. It's the same gauge as their main power wire that we have. So in connecting this really quick, it's different from connecting the old one. Now the old Haltech wideband units, it wasn't CAN, it wasn't the controller area network, it didn't use this type of connection. So if you wanted to plug it into your, whether it was a Haltech engine management or whether it was something else, you had to wire it in, you had to hardwire everything in. So you still have to hardwire everything in if you don't have Haltech, their Haltech Platinum Plug-in Pro. Now I don't know if there are other, like their Elite ECU and stuff like that, if they actually have the CAN port. I would imagine since they're putting the CAN port on this, and they would have it on their newer product line. But that I don't know. You'd have to look that up. Now, let's see. So the older style, you had to wire it in. You had to wire in everything. So, for example, in my Autronic SM4, which I'm going to cut to a video of, and I'm going to talk about the wiring and how that was wired in. But it was different than this. This to wire the gauge in, this little harness actually has wires that split off and would go to the gauges. But on the older style, you actually had to split off the signal wire coming off of their wideband controller and go to, which I don't have a gauge installed on mine, but you have to on my the Celica, the GT4 swapped Celica. So anyway, I'm going to cut to a little video on that and talk about how that's installed. Okay, so here I am at the GT4 swapped Celica, 3S GTE Celica. I've got an Autronic SM4 controlling it. That's my EMS, and I have Haltech's older style wideband. I have their older style wideband controller, which isn't CAN based. It's not the CAN style, so I had to hardwire everything in. So I have a power wire. Some of there's wires all over the place. I didn't exactly dress this up very well, but you can see right here the power wire that just goes straight to my little switched ignition source, and I have this thin wire, this thin ground. That's the sensor ground, and then the other ground. Actually, no, that's the thick one. So the thick one is the actual ground for the Haltech wideband controller, and the thin one is the one that it uses for the signal reference. So it's a signal ground, but they both connect into the chassis ground. And this other, so I have a white wire and a blue wire. Blue wire goes to my. It's a dual channel controller because. Well, that's what I bought. They have a dual channel CAN based, so you can put like one on the left bank, one on the right bank exhaust. With the CAN controller, but I just bought the single channel for the S2000 because that's all it needs. I don't need the dual channel. But with this one, if I want to connect a gauge, I have to. It tells me in the instructions to split off of the signal wire and connect it to a gauge. The CAN-based one is a little bit different. It's a little bit easier to do that. But that's basically it on this one. With wiring it in, it's the same way. You've got power, ground. You have a sensor, signal ground, and then you have the signal wire. So, and then you have the actual harness that goes to the well, the two different ones. This one I have taped up on the end so it stays clean. You have the two different signal wires that go to the O2 sensor, the wideband O2 sensor. So that's how the old ones are connected. Alright, I'm back. So, as I said, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be connecting power for this. Alright, so what I don't need is I don't need this in the way. So I'm just going to set this aside. This, like I showed a second ago, it plugs in. This is just a little CAN controller area network cable. And I'm going to try to feed this in through the firewall so that I can have this for calibrating. I can have it under the hood of the car so I don't have to get down under the dash and turn this trim pot here for calibration. So I can put that under the hood where I don't have to really worry about it. So I'm setting this aside. Now, so this is the main harness, and I guess I don't have to well, I'll partially unwrap it. Now all these wires are labeled, so it says like you really, unless you're trying to mess up or you just really don't know what you're doing, it's pretty hard to mess this up. So they have it where they made it hard to mess up, and they ran these two together. They folded these two together. Okay, let me put this. Oh, they are all together. So it's all one long harness. That plug, this plug, like I said, this is a single channel wideband controller. So this plug would go down to this in the exhaust, the O2 sensor, wideband O2 sensor. Right? So that's where that's going to go. This is the main power wire. So that's going to be connected there. And here, no, stay. And so these three wires go to the gauge. So they would go to the gauge output. So I have my so it's channel 1 output, signal ground, and then gauge power. Like this. So if you're going to be soldering, one, you don't want to breathe it in. Solder, it actually has a little bit of lead in it. So if you look, actually this one doesn't say, but it'll say like it's actually dangerous to breathe it in. You don't want to breathe in the fumes while you're soldering. I'd recommend being like in a ventilated area, being outside, or having somebody else do it. No, being in a ventilated area, being outside, being in a place to where like you're gonna get some fresh air while you're doing this, and that way you don't really have to worry about it, because like there's actually pretty common, like where they make all of our electronics overseas, they have different health requirements and things like that. It's actually pretty common for them to get like brain cancers and it's just stuff like that. You don't want to breathe this in. It's pretty bad stuff. A little bit won't hurt you, but it definitely won't help you. So again, this is my little Viper alarm harness. Now I'm soldering because I don't want to have to worry about connections not being solid enough. So the soldering is like the soldering with the heat shrink tube. It makes an extremely solid, reliable connection. So the heat shrink, it shrinks around it shrinks around the area that will solder together and makes it pretty airtight. It's not perfectly airtight, but it does the job. But it's far better than just taking these wires, twisting them together, and then wrapping some electrical tape around it. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. You don't want to use the little butt connectors. That's, you know, it's hollow on each side, and you know, you put the wire in, you crimp it. Those get loose over time. Copper oxidizes when it's exposed to oxygen, and since that's not sealed up, it will be exposed to oxygen, and what you'll end up getting is just a bad connection. Let's see, the solder. So the solder actually chemically mixes with, not chemically. What do you call it? It melts to the copper. So the solder and the copper end up kind of melting together on the surface level of the copper. So what you're doing when you're soldering is you're actually heating up. And I'm not going to do it with this fuse in. I'm going to take the fuse out. This fuses pop from heat, and I don't know how hot. And I'm soldering pretty close to this fuse, so I'm just going to take it out because I don't want to blow my fuse. But you're basically heating up the copper. So I like, what I do is I heat it up on one side. Actually, I can just do it really quick. So I heat it up on one side, and you can see I have my heat shrink tubing sitting there ready, and I'm actually soldering pretty close to that heat shrink tubing, so it might actually start melting the heat shrink tubing, which I hope it doesn't. That'll make it a little bit harder. But I'm heating up one side of the copper, and this is a 140 watt weller. So I usually hold my breath whenever I'm doing this, so I'm just putting it on a little bit at a time. And I didn't take that fuse out. Dang it. Oh well, it's no big deal. So once you get it hot enough, you see I'm not even touching the soldering iron. I'm actually touching the other side of the copper, and it's melting on because the copper is getting hot enough itself to melt the solder. So the heat is going to follow, or the solder is going to follow heat pretty much. So it's going to follow whichever direction. And it did start to melt. Man, I hate that. This is what I was expecting to happen. I'm soldering too close to where I have my heat shrink tubing, so I'm going to have to get some, I guess, a larger piece of heat shrink tubing and slip it over, because I have a lot of different sizes of heat shrink tubing, but slip it over the end of this, the head of this connection, so that I can slide it down and I can heat shrink around that. Unless it doesn't look like, no, yeah, this happens. Anyway, this is one of the downsides to soldering, because you're soldering too close to where the heat shrink tubing is. So I'm going to have to get a large piece of heat shrink tubing, slip it over. Okay, so I'm back at the car, and this really bothers me when people use things like this to connect wires. Like, for example, this, so it's called a vampire tap, I think. It's something like that. I hate these things. I would rather solder wires together and put heat shrink tube around it and spend a little bit of extra time than use a cheap connector like this. Same thing goes for this, the little butt connectors. Never use the butt connectors, and never use these. Reason why, it's making, trying to squeeze around here under the, so reason why is they tap into the wire and they kind of cut the wire a little bit, which it degrades the signal. And these are the ECU plugs. The ECU, like, this is the most important part of the whole car, and the most expensive. I mean, if something happens, you know, the thing comes loose, and what they actually did was they connected this, which is it's an ECT display driver, engine coolant temperature, I would imagine. So they had this thing connected, which I'm pretty sure it tricks the gauges into displaying something else than what it's supposed to display. So from what the name of it, I mean, I've never installed one of these things, but what the name of it looks like, what it does is shows an actual LED thing somewhere on the somewhere on the gauges. I don't care to use this. I am taking this out, and if all the parts are here, I'm probably just gonna sell it on eBay and hope it still works. But never use these vampire connectors. They're a pain to get off. The next guy that's gonna try to do something with the car is gonna have to not only take this off, but repair the wire and look and hope that it's not that the copper's not actually damaged. And if you're under a dash, that means I'm all down here like almost upside down trying to like fix the wires, take this off, which to take it off I'm trying to like stick my screwdriver in and kind of turn it a little bit to open up the where it's tapped into the wire. It's pretty hard. On this one I've already got it. I can wiggle it out of where it's sitting. But see, stuff like this is frustrating. Car radios, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's okay to use it on a car radio, maybe even an alarm system. I mean, well, I wouldn't want to use it on an alarm system, but it's not as important as, oh, I don't know, let's say car ECU. This was really stupid. It really was. Solder it, do it right the first time. Don't use these things. So you can see, like, when you look down inside of it, there's a wire that's supposed to go through there, parallel to this yellow wire, and then when you squeeze it together with pliers, it bites down on the two wires. So it's not a sealed connection. Air still gets to it. The oxygen is gonna, the copper is gonna oxidize. So over time it's going to add resistance, and it's going to end up causing problems to, you know, whatever it is that you're using it for. So do it right the first time and solder. But I'm going to finish up like running the wires. I've already ran the new O2 sensor underneath the car. So actually, since I'm down here, let me roll under there first, since I have this still going. So what I've done, which it was a pain to get to because it's up there, but I put in my new O2 sensor, Bosch LS 4.2, which it's the same sensor that most of these gauges use. I think it's the same sensor that the old AEM thing had, AEM wideband. So ran it across here. I didn't want to run it too close to the transmission, so I ran it over into this, and I just kind of fed the wire through this little channel. And I have this sheath harness going up, following this up, and then hugging the chassis to go up into the engine bay. Yeah, but this side's in, that's good. My stuff that I'm putting in, it's good. It's all good. None of this AEM junk. The best thing about that AEM unit is that wideband O2 that comes with it, the Bosch LS 4.2. So yeah, and then you can see, like, I've got it routed up here. I've got it routed in a way where it's not going to touch the engine heat. It's not going to touch the engine, and the heat's going to mess it up. So I routed it behind some of the brake lines and things like that, so the brake lines would hold it in place. And I got it zip tied, and up here, and then in through the firewall and into the interior. But I'm going to finish connecting the wires, and I'm going to talk about what I did. All right, now I just started this back to show why you don't use these. They're awful. Reason why: you cannot get them off without almost completely destroying. I have to solder this back together now, because the wire actually broke trying to get this thing off. Now I was being careful, putting the screwdriver in, trying to like pry it up in a way to where the wire didn't get damaged. This thing didn't even come untapped. You can see, like, you look inside, the red wire with the white stripe is still inside of this thing, the sheath of it, and a little bit of copper. So I've got to spend more time soldering this thing back together, all because some genius decided to use these things instead of doing it right the first time, soldering it in, and then, I don't know, maybe I would have left this thing in. That was done. But I'm also pulling this out, whatever it went to. I've got to match up this wire, yellow wire with the green stripe. They actually cut. It hasn't been connected to anything. So I've got to wire that back in. Which connector did I see that on? To here. So I'm going to solder that, put some heat shrink tube around it. This wire, I've got to solder back into the one that I pulled it off of. And I have one more, which is this. Hopefully this wire stays intact when I'm trying to take this thing off. But this is very frustrating, if you can hear the frustration in my voice. Not only because they're using things that should have never been made to begin with, and if they were made, they shouldn't have come with stuff like this company that decided, these guys that probably sent it with they probably sent these little vampire taps with this thing. They're like, oh yeah, they probably say in the instructions, hey, just tap into the, just tap it in, just put it on the wire, crimp it together, and you're good. Because they're trying to make an easy install. They're not saying, hey, you gotta solder, you gotta blah blah blah, because most people don't know how to solder. I'm complaining, I'm ranting. Do not use these regardless of what the instructions say. Soldering is 5 million times better, and I wish I could say I'm not exaggerating, because it would be nice if it were literally that much better. If it were that better. Anyway, this butt connector, I'm going to cut that because that's actually going into this, so that is going to go back into this. Anyway, I'm done complaining. I'm going to finish soldering and spend more time fixing this. So anyway, yeah, I'll be back with the rest of the wiring in a second. Alright, I got everything wired in. I'm just going to show what I did really quick. So my boost control valve I have wired in straight to the fuse box here because I already ran the wire, and plus this is an ignition switched spot right here. If you're looking at the fuse box, there's 3 little pins sticking up on the side of the relay closest to where my fingers are, and it's this little one here, which is the farthest one. So pretty much looking at the car, looking at the fuse box, I guess, what is it? The forwardmost pin to the left, it looks like. It's actually kind of in the middle, but that pin in the middle is the forwardmost pin. So it's ignition switched, and I have the boost control valve going into that, because I'd rather have that ignition switch controlled. Man, I feel like a T-Rex the way I've got to move my arms just to be under this car and be under the dash. So I fixed these wires. There was 4 of them all together that I had to solder back together. One of them, I don't know why, it was just cut completely, and I did find these 2 other wires over here that I don't know why. It's a green one with a black stripe and a blue one with a red stripe. They're just completely cut. I don't know what they go to. I'm gonna try to look that up. I mean, the car runs with the quick tune that I put on the Haltech. But there's my auxiliary harness plugged in. I've got that going to the boost control valve, and then this is my little CAN adapter wire. So I put the CAN wideband up there. It's the CAN wideband controller up here. I put it here because I don't know, I'd rather it not get dirty and be exposed to weather under the hood, even though it is kind of made to be exposed to weather to some extent. But I made this trim pot, which is what's going to have to be adjusted to calibrate it every so often. So the trim pot here, I made it where it's fairly easily accessible. It's all zip tied. It's sitting on top of this vent, this foot vent. So it's sitting there, zip tied to this metal bracket. It's pretty sturdy. It's not really going to move around very much. And this wire here is long enough to where it can be plugged into the top of the Haltech, because the Haltech will be sitting this way against the floor panel, the side kick panel, I guess. And this is long enough to where it'll be able to reach around and plug into there to that CAN port. Now, for the power, because I ran the power wire through the firewall for the wideband controller. So I ran that all the way around here. So this is that I still have to zip tie this and secure it to where it's out of harm's way. But I grounded the one wire to this point right here, the bolt where it goes into the chassis that holds in the fuse box, and I made this. So I soldered these into that waterproof connector that I wasn't going to use, but ended up using it anyway. So right now I just have to connect this fuse, put the cap on it, and put the cover back on this fuse box. This is always hot. This little pin right there that's coming off on the right side of the fuse, the side not closest to the battery, this side is always hot. And there wasn't a fuse there. I don't think there was supposed to be. What actually went there? Oh yeah, so it's blank. So it's this one. So it's nothing's supposed to be there. I don't know if the JDM cars, if something actually came in this, but it's blank for me, so it's what I'm using. It's always hot. That was a requirement per the instruction manual, is it not be switched on the ignition. Otherwise I probably would have done that. So that's it. I just gotta plug that fuse in and start. The next video is gonna be on like an actual tune on the. So I'm gonna run some software to do some screen capture of the on my laptop screen, so that I can show me configuring it. I'm configuring this car with the fuel injectors, and the 50 psi map sensor, which is actually like 35 point something, 35.3, because it's rated in gauge, psi gauge. So it's actually 35 psi map sensor that's in the car, not 50. Let's see. Yeah, so everything's connected. I just gotta plug this in, and it's getting kind of late today, but tomorrow I'll start playing around with it and putting a little baseline, putting a little more than a baseline tune on it. But I will be starting over from scratch for the tune. Yeah, but that's it for this. Thanks for watching. Check out the next video, because it'll be the more interesting one with the I still got to connect the wideband gauge, but the next video will be the more interesting one that's got all of that connected and running. And the wideband gauge is easy. It's just connecting these 3 wires to the gauge. So anyway, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, and check out the next little video in this series of getting this thing going again. All right, thanks. God bless.